Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our continuing study of Philippians. Last week we talked about the mind of Christ. The week before that we talked about self-abnegation and the love that's required to actually put the interest of others before your own. Actually, those two studies could have been put into one lesson. They belong together, but it just makes a lengthy study, so I broke it up into two pieces. Today, we're going to continue in chapter 2, but we're going to study verses 12 through 30. He begins with the word therefore. Paul immediately applies the attitudes and examples of Christ to the problems of the Philippian church. Paul says they have always obeyed, and the question is, who have they always shown obedience to? They've obeyed. Many times Paul has used himself as the example that they're to pattern their lives after. But here I think, though, he's talking about they've always been obedient to God. He has just addressed Christ as being humbled even to the point of death on the cross in obedience. And that would be obedience to God. Let me read verse 8. Let's go back and just take a quick look at it just so we'll know. Chapter 2, verse 8 said, "And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself." Jesus humbled himself by becoming obedient to death. That would be obedient to God. We talked about that, being obedient to God to death, even death on the cross. So we were talking about obedience to God there, and we're going to continue to talk about here. I think they have always been obedient to God. It could be obedient to Paul, but the actual commands are coming from God. And Paul is teaching them so they would be obedient to God. At the very least, they would be obedient to God through the teachings of Paul. But nevertheless, I think here it does actually mean obedience to God. So the same probability applies here, I think. Be obedient even as I am not with you, he says. Did I ever read verse 12? Let me read verse 12. I think I just jumped right in here and forgot to read the verse. Verse 12 says this, "Therefore," there's the therefore I was talking about. "Therefore," after having talked about the mind of Christ, "therefore, my dear friends," which means he's talking to the church at large, "as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling." Forgot to read the verse. I think I did that last week once too. So such obedience and obedience in his absence could mean perseverance, which would confirm that they are truly saved, meaning that they had a sincere faith, which is important to know and hope for because of what we're getting ready to talk about. The importance of them being saved is a very great importance because of what we're getting ready to talk about. He said, work out your salvation. Continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. That's the end of verse 12. Not for purposes of being saved, because they're already saved. But this phrase points back to the meaning in chapter 1, verse 27. Let me read that. Chapter 1, verse 27 said, "Whatever happens, he's talking about conduct. "Whatever happens, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then whether I come and see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel." So he says, work out your salvation, not for the purposes of being saved, because they're already saved. This phrase points back to that verse that I just read, and it has to do with conduct. He said, conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel. In other words, look like Christ. That's what we spent last week talking about. That's what we spent the week before talking about, self-abnegation. What would Jesus do in relationships? Do that. Be like Jesus, look like him as in your actions that you're going to be doing. The use of the word salvation in this context would mean something more like sanctification, becoming like Christ, looking like Christ, as in 127. So when we've talked about being sanctified, when you get saved, you get sanctified, but it's a progressive sanctification. I don't want to be getting ahead of myself, but he says here, let me just say it here, we'll be talking about it in a minute. And he says, and do it with fear and trembling. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Work on your sanctification with fear and trembling. We get sanctified when we get saved, but we're not completely sanctified. What we're trying to do as we become sanctified is to be like Christ, and it's a progress. It's a process. Our life changes when we get saved, but it's not changed completely. We have a new spirit in us, but there's still this thing about understanding what God wants us to do and how he wants us to be, and knowing what Jesus would be and what he would do. All those things are not instantaneous. It takes time. It's progressive. And as we progress through this process of becoming like Jesus, we're becoming more and more sanctified as we go, with the ultimate goal of being like Jesus when we're 100% sanctified, which won't happen until we're in heaven. But nevertheless, he says, do it with fear and trembling. He really means fear and trembling. But in this context, it is more like being serious about working out your salvation. Serious about being like Christ, being serious about the matter of sanctification. But why if we're already saved? Why do we need to worry about that if we're already saved? Look at verse 13. Verse 13 says this: for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. So why do we want to work on our sanctification with fear and trembling? It's because God is working in us. He is working for you to understand, and me to understand his will, the motivations, the desires of salvation, which is what sanctification is all about. He is working for you to understand his will and the drive to properly work out your salvation, your sanctification. He's working on you to be able to act, or to work towards salvation, or not to work towards salvation because you're already saved, but work towards sanctification. So we are properly motivated and we have the power to act. It is God working in us to provide this to his good purpose. He provides this for us to be able to accomplish things in accordance with his purposes. His purpose is for us to become like Christ. His purpose is for us to become sanctified. But we must remember that sanctification is not instant. I've already said that in a roundabout way. When we get saved, we're sanctified to a point. It's not 100% instant. It's a progressive situation. In our humanity, we make wrong decisions, wrong choices along the way, but we are in the process of becoming like Jesus, where we understand and obey his will more and more as time goes on. So that's what we're talking about, this process of becoming sanctified. It's progressive sanctification, and it comes with trying to become like Jesus, making mistakes, still sinning, doing things we weren't wanting to do, we found ourselves doing anyway, but we overcome those things as time goes on. We become more and more like Jesus, become more and more sanctified. And that's what Paul is talking about. Work out your salvation. That's what he's talking about. Work out your sanctification. So let's look at verses 14. Let me read verse 14 to 16. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure children of God, without fault, in a warped and crooked generation. Warped and crooked generation, that's the NIV talking. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. All right, let me read 14 again. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. Conduct. Conduct is a big word, a big attitude to be thinking about as we read through these verses. There were two ladies I mentioned last week. We're going to see it when we get to chapter 4, but there are two ladies that were arguing in chapter 4. And it was the kind of thing where I've talked about this before, where two Christians in a church meeting start arguing in the process of renovating the church, get to fighting and arguing about what color the carpet in the sanctuary should be. It shouldn't be things that you fight about. It should be things that you're able to work together and accomplish. I was a member of a church one time when I believe I was in high school. We had a wonderful pastor. I remember him preaching the gospel every Sunday. It seemed like it was every Sunday. It may not have been every Sunday, but he was a wonderful man. And it was a small church. The church was not a wealthy church, not well-heeled as we might call it. But some people started resenting him for whatever reason. I didn't even know that was going on. But they had a big blow-up about the pastor using the church lawnmower to mow his own yard. And he ended up being fired over it. Our conduct has to be like Christ. That means, particularly in dealing with Christian people, we need to be able to work things out. We need to apply our principles as Christians to every situation that we find ourselves in. So here again, he's addressing the church at large. So really, the address is to the individual people that make up the church. No complaining, no arguing, means no whining. If you cannot function in a corporate environment, in other words, in the church at large, you cannot function individually either. Another way to put it is, arrogance and selfishness is pride manifested. Complaining and arguing is the manifestation of arrogance and pride. Paul says, don't do it. Look at verse 15. Why not do it? Verse 15 says this. Let me read 14 and 15. Do everything without grumbling or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky. Blameless and pure, again, points to sanctification as a process. You must become this way, for you are not that way now. I don't even know you, and I know you're not. I know I'm not. It's a process. You will become children of God without fault, but I might add, probably not too soon. When you're talking about without fault, probably not too soon. You will become children of God in a crooked and warped generation. How is that different from today? Think there's a difference? Probably worse today. Things don't get better with time, they get worse. Not in your life. You need to understand what I'm saying here. Things of the world on balance does not get better with time. It gets worse. If it was getting better with time, this thing of Jesus coming in judgment wouldn't be as big a deal. But it's getting worse. If you can do this, work on your sanctification, you will look like shining stars in the universe to those of the community. The difficult part of this, they will hate you all the more. The more you become like Christ, the more you run the risk of being hated. Jesus talked about that. We talked about it in the Gospel of John. They're going to hate you because they hate me. That's what Jesus said. They're going to hate you because they hate him. You will be like the light of the shining stars in the darkness. All right, let's look at verse 16. Let me back up. Then you will shine among them like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life. And then I will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I do not run or labor in vain. Living this way, you will be holding out or displaying the gospel. As you look like Christ in your daily walk. That's important. See, we've talked about that before too. This daily walk is daily. That's why it's called a daily walk. It's every day. It's not just Sunday. Sunday you might be more in tune because you're in a worship environment as you go to church and that sort of thing. But when Monday gets here, that's part of the daily walk. Okay? And so as you look like Christ in your daily walk, then as Paul sees it firsthand or hears about it from others because he's not there, he will know his work was not in vain. If he spent his time teaching you, preaching to you, getting you saved and all those things, and he hears about your daily walk being more and more sanctified, more and more like Christ as time goes on, and he's going to be really blessed because of it, and he's going to even be able to brag about it, if you allow me to use that term. Not only this, but Paul will be able to boast. I've got it in my notes here. Not only this, but Paul will be able to boast about it on the day of Christ, which is Judgment Day, second coming. So when would he boast? For us, he would boast at the judgment seat of Christ. We're already judged. When we get saved, we forego any judgment for our sin. We're saved. We're judged righteous. It is credited to us as righteousness, as it said when he talking about Abraham. And we will stand before Christ in judgment, not in judgment, but at the judgment seat of Christ, where we are judged for the giving of rewards in heaven. We're going to heaven, so we've already been judged righteous to go to heaven. But the way we live out our lives in our daily walk is what this is talking about. On the day of Christ is what he's talking about when he comes again. But we will have already been judged by then. When we stand before he's talking about the standing before Jesus at the judgment seat of Christ. So let's look at verse 17. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and I rejoice with all of you. I'm glad and I rejoice with all of you, even if I am being poured out like a drink offering. He said, poured out like a drink offering. He's saying here, he uses the word being, which means it's already happening for him. He's already being poured out as a drink offering. The drink offering accompanies a sacrifice. For Paul, is he talking about impending martyrdom? He might be. Suffering while he is in prison? It might be. It does seem to be thoughts about his life, and it accompanies the sacrifice. He's being poured out like a drink offering. The sacrifice is the actual offering, their sacrifice, and their sacrifice was their support of Paul. All right. Their service accompanies the offering, and it was produced by their faith. Their gift to him was a sacrifice and a service to God, and it was coming from their faith. This speaks of Paul's humility. In the ritual, the sacrifice is primary, their part. The drink offering, his part, is secondary. The primary part of the sacrifice, he's saying, is theirs, not his. His is secondary. So let's look at verse 18. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. Let me just properly understand this. Let me back up just a little bit. He says, I am glad and rejoice with all of you, so you too should be glad and rejoice with me. Rather than being discouraged about his circumstances, Paul had great joy. He rejoices, and he wanted them to rejoice with him. 4 times at the end of verse 17 and here in verse 18, 4 times he uses joy, and it's mentioned 2 times for joy for him, rejoicing for him, and 2 times rejoicing for them. You should be glad and rejoice as I am glad and rejoice. Paul's in prison. That's what he's talking about. Don't worry about me. Rejoice with me, he says. And let's look at verse 19. Paul, he's going to be talking about Timothy here for a second. Paul is in prison, and he's talking about them. He is telling them he will be sending 2 men to them. He's going to be sending Timothy. He's going to be talking about that in verse 19 to 24. And he's going to be sending a man that we don't hear about very much. His name is Epaphroditis, and he'll be talked about in verse 25 to 27. So let me read verse 19. We're going to be talking about these 2 men. Verse 19 says, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, that I may also be cheered when I receive news about you. I hope in the Lord Jesus. In other words, the Lord willing and the creek don't rise. We throw that term around just without even thinking about what we're saying. The Lord willing. I'll see you next week. The Lord willing and the creek don't rise. If the Lord's willing and the creek don't, are we really saying that, or is that just a saying that just passed around? When Paul says it, he didn't actually use those words. He says, I hope in the Lord Jesus. He's saying the same thing. He puts his hope in the Lord Jesus about everything. We're throwing away around an idiom or just a well-used slogan or phrase, maybe without even thinking about it too much. Paul is using something similar, but he really means it. Paul was always wanting to live in the will of God. Really, he was always wanting to live in the will of God, even when he was a Pharisee and persecuting the church. He thought he was living in the will of God, and he was sincere about it. He saw the light, so to speak. He got converted. Now he knows what living in the will of God really is, and he really means that he really wants to live in the will of God. God's will permanently God's will permitting, he will send Timothy to them. I think Paul is wanting information about the church when Tim returns to him. That would be good, reliable information. Would lift Paul's spirits to hear good things, complete things, the kinds of things where he actually had to read between the lines because he knows them so well. Speaking of Timothy, Timothy knows the church and could probably discuss what he knows with Paul when he sees him. Okay? He knows him so well, he'll be able to look at him and know what's going on, and he's going to be able to read between the lines and really tell Paul what is happening. I hope you understand what I'm saying. He will see their conduct, how they're running their business, how they're running the church, in other words, how they're working with the gospel and those things. And he's going to be able to read between the lines the things that they don't say and know about their maturity. And that's what Paul wants to know about. So let's look at verse 20. I have no one else like him. Now that is a strong statement. Paul says, I have no one else like him who will show a genuine concern for your welfare. The King James says they are like-minded. I have nobody to send like him. He is like me. We are like-minded. He shares Paul's burdens and commitments. He partners in his ministry. He did not say they have the same desires, but they are like-minded. Being like-minded implies the same life principles. They both feel to live as Christ, to die as gain. Remember that? Philippians, what is that, 4? No, we just read it. I won't go back and find it. To live as Christ, to die as gain. Timothy is definitely important in Paul's life, and especially his letters to Timothy. All right, let's look at, so furthermore, Timothy takes a genuine interest in their welfare. That probably is going to go, we're going to see this a little bit as we go a little bit further. It's probably going to have a lot of self-abnegation coming into it. We talked about in the first part of chapter 2, the kind of behavior and conduct that Jesus expects of us is the same kind that he expects of himself. He said that we're to do the same thing, be the same way. Timothy is going to be that way. Let's look at verse 21. For everyone looks out for their own interest, not those of Jesus Christ. That's a little different slant. Taken with verse 20, the last part of verse 20, this takes self-abnegation to a new, higher level. The implication is he is able to take the interest of Jesus Christ before his own, which means he would also allow for the interest of others before his own. Verse 22. But you know that Timothy has proved himself, because as a son with his father, he has served with me in the work of the gospel. Timothy's value was found in his commitment to Paul in the work of the gospel. He was committed to Christ, but he was committed to Paul to work, particularly work in the gospel, it says here. Paul added the commendation of Timothy that he served as a son serves his father. That's how they work together. Paul is Timothy's spiritual father. Timothy recognizes that, and he works with Paul on that basis with the same level of commitment that a son has to a father in working in the same business. All right? So verse 23 and 24, let me read those two verses. I hope, therefore, to send him as soon as I see how things are going with me. He's sitting in prison, remember that. I hope, therefore, to send him as soon as I see how things are going with me. And then verse 24 says, and I am confident in the Lord that I myself will come soon. Once again, Paul shows the positive outlook, expectant in the Lord. He has every confidence that he will be able to come, but if not, I will send Timothy, he says. Timothy will come with the commendation that he is the best Paul has to send. You can see now why those letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy, are back there, because Paul and Timothy have this working relationship, and they correspond and stay up with each other. Okay, then we get to Epaphroditus now in verse 25. Let me read verse 25. Verse 25, but I think it is necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. He's sending him back. So Epaphroditus has been there, but I'm going to send him back, and we're going to talk about why right now. Epaphroditus is one that they sent to take care of Paul. His service to Paul was a gift from the church. We can't come, but we can send Epaphroditus, in other words. Paul is sending him back. He refers to him as a fellow worker, fellow soldier, and your messenger. Okay, he was a gift from the church. Verse 26. Let me read verse 26. Did I read 26? No, I did not. Verse 26 says this. For he longs for all of you and is distressed because you heard he was ill. Very important thing to know. It sounds like he could be homesick. He longs for you. But it's something that's much more than that. We're going to see that. And he was worried about him. Paul was worried about him when they heard he was sick. They were worried about him when they heard he was sick. Paul was to relieve them of any concerns that they may have. That's what he's trying to do when he sends him back. Verse 27 says this. Indeed, he was ill and almost died. So if it's homesickness, it's a pretty severe case of homesickness. He almost died from it. But God had mercy on him and did not on him only, but also on me, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Paul loves this man. He apparently got sick on the way to see Paul. The church sent him over there, and along the way he got sick. When he got there, he apparently showed the symptoms and manifested the sickness, and he got sick and almost died. So it's something that's pretty serious. And Paul says this is very interesting. God had mercy on both of them, on himself and on that Epaphroditus, in that he did not die. He showed mercy on Paul because of the sadness that would come over Paul if he did die while he was there in service. That sounds terrible to put it that way, but it's a deep feeling that Paul has for this man. He wants the church to take him back because he's too sick to work, and he's nearly, at death's door there for a while. He needs to go home. Okay, Paul doesn't want him to die while he's there. He doesn't want him to die when he gets back there either. But there's going to be a sorrow that falls over Paul if he is there and dies in service to Paul. That's all we're trying to say. Paul wanted them to be sure they understood how sick he really was. 3 times, he says, he pointed out the severe sickness that he almost died from. He did it in verse 26, verse 27, and he's going to do it again in verse 30. All right, so let's go on now. Let's look at verse 28. Therefore, I'm all the more eager to send him, so that when you see him again, you may be glad, and I may have less anxiety. So Paul is, good Christian that he is, he's wringing his hands over this, worried about this man that's so sick. He wants him to get home to his family, I suppose, and to his friends, and to his church leaders and the people he works with in the church. So just being around those kind of people can lift that man's spirit and probably have some healing properties that go along with it. I don't know. So he is eager to send him so that they will finally be happy to see him, and Paul can quit worrying about it. It's terrible to talk about Paul worrying. That's exactly what he was doing. He had some anxiety about it. All right. So let's look at verse 29 to 30. Let me read both verses. So then, welcome him in the Lord with great joy, and honor people like him, because he almost died for the work of Christ. He risked his life to make up for the help you yourselves could not give me. Epaphroditus was able to serve when they could not. He could block out some time where he could go to where Paul was when they could not. He risked his life in serving. Welcome him home, Paul says. He is a hero in the Lord. Like servicemen coming home from military duty as heroes, he comes back as a hero in the Lord from serving Paul. Oh, all right, that's all I have for you today. I want to thank you for studying with me.